She was called the woman with the dogs, not because she loved animals, but because she used them to kill. And when the day came for her to face justice, she walked to the gallows in complete silence. No tears, no apology, no remorse. Just nothing. There are war criminals history remembers with long chapters and heavy books. And then there are ones like Juana Bormann, who slipped through the cracks of popular memory, even though what she did was unthinkable. She wasn't a general. She didn't command armies. She didn't sign orders from behind a desk in Berlin. She was a guard, a female guard at some of the most horrifying places the Nazi regime ever built. And in those places, she didn't just follow orders. She enjoyed it. That single detail separates her story from cold Nazi bureaucracy and turns it into something far more disturbing, far more personal. Because Juana Bormann forces us to ask a question we don't like asking. How does an ordinary woman become a monster? If you're new to X history, this is what we do here. We don't sanitize the past. We don't make it comfortable. We go straight into the moments history tried to bury, and we pull out the truth. Hit subscribe. Now let's go back to the beginning. Juana Bormann was born on September 10, 1893, in a small German village. Nothing about her early life screamed danger. She grew up poor. She worked as a domestic servant for years, cleaning houses, invisible to the world. And here's the uncomfortable detail nobody talks about. She applied to become an SS guard, largely out of economic desperation. She needed the job. That fact is deeply unsettling, because it means the Holocaust wasn't only built by fanatics, it was also staffed by the ordinary. She entered SS guard training in 1938. Her first posting, Ravensbrück, the largest Nazi camp built specifically for women. And something inside her unlocked. Survivors described her as unpredictable. One moment she'd walk past you. The next, punishment came from nowhere. That randomness was the torture. She moved through the camp with large German shepherds. And unlike guards who used dogs as a threat, Bormann used hers as weapons. She would set them on prisoners deliberately. Women already starved and broken, and witnesses said she smiled. In 1943, she was transferred to a place far worse, Auschwitz, where the trains never stopped, where the selections happened daily, where the gas chambers ran without pause. And Juana Bormann walked straight into the middle of it and kept going. By 1943, Auschwitz was operating at full and horrifying capacity. Trains arrived daily from across occupied Europe. Families were separated on the platform within minutes of arriving. Children went left, mothers went right, and the gas chambers ran without pause, without mercy, without end. It was into this world that Juana Bormann was transferred, and she didn't flinch. Not even slightly. She wasn't the loudest guard in Auschwitz. She didn't give speeches or theatrical displays of power. She was worse than that. She was consistent. Day after day, the same cold routine, the same dogs, the same silence before the violence. Survivors who later testified described a woman who seemed to feel genuinely nothing, and that emptiness was more terrifying than rage ever could have been. Other guards could be read. You could sense their mood. You could try to stay invisible, but Bormann gave you nothing to read. No warning, no pattern, just the sudden sound of her dogs and then screaming. By early 1945, the war was collapsing around the Nazi regime. The Soviet forces were advancing from the east. The Allied forces were pushing from the west. The SS began evacuating camps, not to save prisoners, but to hide evidence. What followed became known as the death marches. Tens of thousands of already dying prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of miles in freezing winter conditions. Those who fell were shot. Those who slowed down were shot. Those who begged for water were shot. Bormann marched with them, still watching, still in uniform, still carrying her authority like it meant something, even as the Reich that gave it to her was crumbling into ash. Her final destination was Bergen-Belsen, a camp in northern Germany that had become something beyond description by early 1945. It was so catastrophically overcrowded, so ravaged by typhus, starvation, and disease, that prisoners were dying faster than bodies could be moved. When British soldiers liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, Veterans who had fought through the entire war said they were not prepared for what they walked into. Bormann was still there when they arrived. She didn't flee, she didn't disguise herself. And the moment British forces began taking names and gathering testimonies, the survivors remembered her immediately. Her name came up again and again. Her face was recognized. Her dogs were remembered. The women she had hurt had not forgotten a single detail. She was arrested and charged as part of the Belsen Trial, one of the first major war crimes trials conducted by the British military, held in Lüneburg, Germany in September 1945. Alongside her stood 44 other former camp staff, both male and female. But among all of them, the testimonies against Bormann were some of the most visceral, most personal, and most damning. Survivor after survivor took the stand and described what she had done, not as a distant bureaucrat following orders, but as someone who had chosen cruelty, up close and personal, repeatedly, over years. The court found her guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. The morning of December 13, 1945 was cold and gray in Hameln, Germany. Inside Hameln Prison, the final preparations were being made. Juana Bormann had been found guilty. The sentence had been confirmed. And now, the day that survivors had testified for, wept for, and barely survived long enough to see had finally arrived. She was 52 years old. She walked to the gallows without dramatic outburst. No final speech, no breakdown, no last-minute confession that might have given survivors even a small piece of closure. Just the same cold silence she had carried through every camp, every selection, every moment of deliberate cruelty. Even at the end, she gave nothing. The execution was carried out by Pierrepoint, the British chief executioner, who was responsible for hanging a significant number of Nazi war criminals following the Belsen Trial. He later wrote about the experience in his memoirs, describing the process as something he approached with professional discipline, even when the weight of what these individuals had done was impossible to ignore. Bormann was hanged alongside other convicted camp staff. It was over quickly. But here is the question that lingers long after the trapdoor closes. Did justice actually happen? Survivors were asked this in interviews for decades afterward, and the answers were complicated. Many said yes, that seeing the legal system name her crimes, record her name, and hold her accountable was something meaningful and necessary. But many others said something more difficult, that no execution could return what was taken, that the dogs could not be uncalled, that the women who died in Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen under her watch were still gone, and no sentence changes that. That tension between legal justice and human grief is something historians still sit with when studying the Belsen Trial. It was a landmark moment. It established early precedent that following orders was not an acceptable legal defense. It put female perpetrators on trial at a time when the world was still barely processing the idea that women could be war criminals at all. Because that was part of what made Bormann and guards like her so destabilizing to post-war society. They broke a deeply held assumption that women were naturally more compassionate, more humane, more incapable of systematic violence. Bormann proved that assumption catastrophically wrong, and that lesson, uncomfortable as it is, remains one of the most important things her story teaches us. Evil is not gendered. Cruelty is not gendered. The capacity to dehumanize another human being does not belong exclusively to any category of person. It lives in systems, in permissions, in ideologies that tell ordinary people that certain other people do not deserve to be treated as human. That is what the Nazi regime built. Not just gas chambers and barbed wire, but a complete psychological framework that turned domestic servants and struggling workers into instruments of mass murder. Juana Bormann did not begin her life as a monster. She became one. Step by step, posting by posting, dog attack by dog attack. And that process, that gradual transformation, is exactly why her story cannot be reduced to a simple villain narrative and then forgotten. We have to look at it. We have to understand it. Because the conditions that produced her did not disappear in 1945. The impulse to dehumanize, to classify, to decide that some lives matter less. That impulse did not die in Hameln prison on a gray December morning. It only went quiet for a while. And history, real history, is the act of making sure we never forget what that quiet is capable of becoming.